Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Vanka Murals Table Talk. My name is Anna Deering, and I'm the Executive Director of the Society to Preserve the Millvale Murals of Matzo Vanka. We are the independent nonprofit organization, and we're celebrating our 30th year working to save and share the 25 murals painted by immigrant artist Matzo Vanka in 1937 and 1941 on the walls of St. Nicholas Croatian Catholic Church in Millvale. A number of you are joining us for the first time, so I'm going to ask you, if I can get it up here, to do a quick poll just to kind of see who's in the audience. So if you can respond to the poll, we'll just take a minute. Wow, we're getting about a 50-50 split on this. So thanks very much for responding to that. Really, what we're excited about is that the murals are becoming much less of a hidden treasure, but we're always excited to introduce new audiences. Docent-led tours are happening, obviously masks and safety involved, but public tours are on Saturdays at 11. And private tours can be arranged at other times. And I just want to encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to visit our website, vankamurals.org. And it offers a solid introduction, but we really tell you, you have to see them in person. They have to be seen to be believed. So we hope you'll come soon. I do want to do a quick thank you to people who added a donation to their registration. Contributions like those help to ensure the future of the murals and help to make programming like this possible. And I will pop a donate link in the chat later. So if you want to donate tonight or a future time, please do. And now I'm going to do my real introduction. So at the turn of the century, Pittsburgh was home to nearly 40,000 Croatians. Vanka's murals, sited in a working class immigrant church, helped to preserve and celebrate their stories. His art pays tribute to heritage, community, and faith. And it also celebrates immigrant contributions to our regional and national progress, as well as their tremendous sacrifices. And we're pleased to have Ian Nagoski with us tonight to share more stories about immigrants. And this is something of an encore. He presented one of the last live programs at St. Nicholas in 2020 before everything came to an end. And before I introduce Rich Pell, who's our host tonight, I just wanted to make a quick housekeeping note, which is that this program is going to run to the end of our time frame, so to 8 p.m. And so we won't be having a traditional Q&A session at the end, but you're very welcome to add questions to the using the Q&A function or the chat, and we'll try to address some questions along the way. And I know Ian is going to be posting some contact information, so you can be in touch with him. And now our host for tonight is Rich Pell, who's on the screen here. He's a professor at Carnegie Mellon and the director of the Center of Post-Natural History. The center is a local museum dedicated to the advancement of knowledge related to the complex interplay between culture, nature, and biotechnology. And if you'll permit me, a fun fact is that Rich's class, Art at the End of the World, was the inspiration for Ian's visit to St. Nicholas last year. And that just makes me need to ask, Rich, how did you know and why didn't you tell us when, last year?
I've just been an early adopter all along.
Welcome.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, my name is Rich Pell, and I do teach at Carnegie Mellon and run a little museum here in town. We're currently closed, but we hope to be back up and running in June. I have known Ian Nagoski for 30 years. We first met at the high school lunch table. And from the moment that we met, Ian has been introducing me to new music. So it is incredibly gratifying to witness him doing the same now for so many others. Ian is skilled at finding music that has been passed over or forgotten by history, and he gives it back to us. Whether it's the music of immigrants to the United States, or trained songbirds, or virtuosic whistlers, or recordings of contagious laughter, each is a gift beyond measure. And he, more than anyone else, taught me as an artist and a storyteller how to turn towards something that seems strange or unfamiliar and allow it to tell you its story. One of these occasions began right here in Pittsburgh at Jerry's Records in Squirrel Hill. Ian came across a remarkably beat up old 78 RPM record from the 1920s that had been used to teach canaries how to improve their singing abilities. This record had no obvious value to seemingly anyone else. It was just kind of a strange thing. But to Ian, it opened up a research project into the musical relationship between birds and people. And that project, titled Bird-like and Wingless, became an ongoing collaborative effort between Ian and my museum, the Center for Post-Natural History. It's since been exhibited in the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin and the Wellcome Collection in London, the Peel Museum in Baltimore, and exists today here in Pittsburgh. A recording used in the project was selected by Ian to be included in the Moon Arc project, where a titanium disc of a recording of a nightingale will be placed on the surface of the moon, and if left undisturbed, will remain there for the next 1 billion years. Ian Nagoski is a self-taught musicologist in a class all his own. He finds the records, he does the audio restoration himself, conducts the biographical research himself, and tells the stories. His Canary Records label has, by my count, 71 releases in its roster. All of them are available to be listened to for free or purchased at canary-records.bandcamp.com. He's spoken throughout Europe and in the US before the Library of Congress, the Woody Guthrie Center, the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, Anthology Film Archives, and just last year at St. Nicholas Croatian Church in Millvale. It is now my great pleasure to pass the mic to Ian Nagoski. Take it away, Ian.
Hey, everybody. How's it all going? Oh, I can't hear you. Welcome to my basement. I'm here in West Baltimore in my basement, and I'm going to be shouting into my computer for the next hour and a half almost. It's a strange situation and different from shows that I have normally done for years and years. I've done a lot of touring where I go around and I give talks, playing records and telling their stories. And I've done so for, it's coming up on 20 years now. And this situation is different. It's not like sitting together, listening to records and stories, which is a bummer, but it's got its upside. Pardon me. The upside being that it's like show and tell a little bit. It's like the third grade with a combination of show and tell and book report. So I can kind of like play you stuff and show you stuff and, you know, give some stories. Now, on these tours that I've done and in these shows I normally do, I approach it like George Carlin, like a stand-up comedy routine where every year I develop an hour of material and I do that material. You know, it's actually usually more than an hour because I, as you will see, talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. This is not that. This is, well, I was going to go on tour and then it turns out I'm not, because, you know, nobody is. And instead, I'm going to just kind of like show you some stuff. I'm going to tell some stories and play some records. And yeah, hopefully it'll be fun. I can see the chat, so I'll glance at that from time to time. Yeah, everybody's doing okay. You can hear me all right? Say yes, somebody on the chat thing.
Loud and clear.
Okay, good. Rich says yes. Okay, and I'm going to test the sound just real quick to make sure y'all can hear that too. Okay, ready? Heard that? Everybody?
Sounds great.
Groovy. Okay, good. All right. So what I'm going to do is, February 2020, I gave a talk at the church at St. Nicholas, where Max Vanka's paintings are, which is amazing. It's unbelievable. You gotta go. If you're anywhere in the Pittsburgh area, please go. Oh, and please donate. They're really being very kind by allowing me this opportunity, and I'm grateful for it. So, hey, that'd be great. So, a million thanks to Anna, and a million thanks to Rich Pell, who is just the best friend a guy could ever have. Known him a really long time. He's an extraordinary person. So the last talk I gave and that I toured around, it was about immigration, and it was addressed to America and our kind of problem with immigration. And I gave a kind of history of it, and you can see it on, actually that show is up on Vimeo, if you're interested. I'm gonna repeat a little bit from that, but not much. I'm mostly gonna be telling some stories I haven't told before, and playing records I mostly haven't played before, except one. But I am gonna kind of pick up where I left off. At the end of those shows, I was typically reading a passage from a book that I love. And at that show, I had talked too much and didn't have time to read that passage. So I'm going to start by reading it now. And we'll just pick up where we left off as if nothing has happened, and then go from there, okay? So this is a book by a immigrant author named Anzia Jezierska. Here, let me show you. This is Anzia. I've been calling her the patron saint of a lot of my work. It's her first book from 1923, published by Funk and Wagnalls. She went on to write a bunch of books that are widely read and widely circulated. Hungry Hearts is by far the most famous. They made a silent film of it in the 20s, which is fantastic. It's like as funny as every episode of Roseanne. It's like it's a home sitcom kind of thing about immigrant life on the Lower East Side and a family and stuff that goes on in the family. It's a great movie. People don't watch it very much. And books that are turned into movies, particularly at the time, tend not to be good. Hungry Hearts is a good one. She also wrote The Bread Givers, not a bad book. Salome of the Tenements has not been republished for some reason since the 20s. But Children of Loneliness is her first book and has never been reprinted for some stupid reason. And it includes the first thing she ever published, which was in Good Housekeeping magazine. And I'm just going to read you how it starts. 1920. When the editor told me that he would give me the chance to speak to Americans out of my heart, to say freely, not what I ought to feel, not what Americans want me to feel, but what I actually do feel, something broke loose in me, a tightness that had held me strained like one whose fists are clenched, resisting what? Had I not come to America with open outstretched arms, all of my earthly possessions tied up in a handkerchief, all of the hopes of humanity singing in my heart? Had I not come to join hands with all those thousands of dreamers who had gone before me in search of the golden land? As I rushed forward with hungry eagerness to meet the expected welcoming, the very earth danced under my feet. All that I was, all that I had, I held out in my bare hands to America, the beloved prayed for land. But no hand was held out to meet mine. My eyes burned with longing, seeking for a comprehending glance. Where are the dreamers? Cried my heart. My hands dropped down, my gifts unwanted. I found no dreamers in America. I found rich men, poor men, educated men, ignorant men, struggling, all struggling for bread, for rent, for banks, for mines, rich and poor, educated and ignorant, straining, wearing out their bodies, their brains for the possession of things, money, power, position, their dreams forgotten. I had expected to work in America, but work at a thing I loved, work with my mind and my heart, prepared for my work by education. I had dreamed of free colleges, free schools. Where could I learn to give out my inmost thoughts and feelings to this world? But no sooner did I come off the ship than hunger drove me to the sweatshop to become a hand, not a brain, not a soul, not a spirit, just a hand, cramped, deadened into part of a machine, a hand fit only to grasp and not to give. And so she goes on from there and explains that by articulating her disillusionment and criticisms of America, that she was able to move ahead with what she really needed to do, which was to fight just like she fought to eat, but to fight for her dreams and fight to create a life for herself as a Jewish woman from Poland on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Same year, 1920, Survey magazine published a little satirical piece on immigration that began, "Come all you foreigners and jump into this magic kettle. You are colored and discolored with things that do not fit well with the affairs in America. In fact, to speak frankly, there is a certain taint about you. Your clothes are ugly and ill-fitting. Your language is barbaric. Immediately, you will become like us. Your slacks will be exchanged for the latest Fifth Avenue clothes. The magic process is certain. Money back if we fail." Money back. Yeah, money. All right, so here's a family photo album from New England, German immigrants, I guess, from the first decade of the 20th century. It's got a big latch on it, and inside there's spots for pictures. Now, what's on the cover of the family photo album? It's got this nice velour back, but the cover is a laminated picture of a boat. It's a steamship. And it's surrounded by little American insignia all over, right? So why would this be the family photo album? Because that's mom. If your mother carried you for 9 months, this one carried you for 2 weeks, and then you were reborn. And you came to the US, and you were new, and everything started over. Kind of, mostly. Well. So look, I'm interested in immigration, and it's an important thing to understand when I'm dealing with these old records. See, what I do is I accumulate old records and I listen to them, and I try and figure them out if I like them. It's been a behavior of mine since I was kind of in my late teens, I guess, but I was a record guy for way longer than that. Anyway, so trying to figure out old records is the thing. Now, it happens that in Pittsburgh, there was a guy named Thomas Bell who wrote the single greatest immigration novel ever written in the United States, I think. It's called Out of This Furnace, and it's about the steel mills outside of Pittsburgh. And it's in print. A lot of people have read it. It's a great book. Everybody knows it. His other novels, no one reads. No one has ever read. They're not in print. So there's one of them. It's called Comes a Time. This one's from 46. And he deals with the real heart of the matter that I want to get to in some of all of this. How different was the world when confronted at 40? At 20, New York had been authentically the wonder city of the world, a city of wide avenues with the sea at its edge and the smell of the sea in its winds, men from the ends of the earth jostling one in the street, and the loot of the world for sale in the shops. At 40, he reflected, New York was the office in which you worked, and the bedroom in which you slept, and in between, too many people living too close together. At 20, nothing was more certain than you were going to be rich and famous. At 40, you knew you'd never be, and you couldn't even pretend you didn't care, that money, after all, wasn't everything, because by the time you were 40, you'd learned it very nearly was. At 20, the world made sense. At 40, you looked around at you with the helpless, numb bewilderment of a man lost in a strange land. At 20, you had a whole lifetime before you. At 40, you had, with luck, 20 years. 20 years wasn't so much. It could be spanned with a memory. It could pass in the twinkling of an eye. It had. See, that's what I'm really interested in. is memory, the construction of time. I have a problem with my brain where I get bored super, super easy. And so this behavior of mine of books and records and stuff is all because I can't live without constant discovery, new information, you know, the thrill of learning something. And so doing talks like this or making records or whatever it is just my way of making something out of a neurological peculiarity, let's say. And what that peculiarity really is a way of perceiving time and how it moves, that boredom thing, right? And listening back to the old records that I encounter and that you don't come across all the time, that aren't widely known, that aren't thought about, that aren't remembered, is it's a source of joy and discovery, and it's a way of meditating on remembering and forgetting itself, of the passage of time, getting older, dying, which is kind of what it's about. Our brains are wired to understand time passing sequentially. It doesn't. Time doesn't operate like that objectively in the universe, but that's how we see it. That's how the Bible is structured, right? Beginning, middle, end. That's how we perceive life: birth, living, death. It's not really fundamentally true, and it's knowable that it's not true. A lot of monks for a long time have known that, but it does seem that way. And it seems that way because of how memory is constructed. So there's a nice book called Why Life Speeds Up as You Get Older, a collection of essays by a neurologist. And he points out that autobiographical memory recalls and forgets at the same time. It is as if you were having the notes of your life taken by an obstreperous company secretary who meticulously documents those things you would rather forget, and during your finest hours, pretends to be industriously at work when actually he still has the cap of his pen screwed on. I think that cultural memory operates more or less the way individual autobiographical memory works. The story you tell about yourself, the story we tell ourselves about America, is just a story. And there are pains and humiliations that are unspeakable that you try not to remember. And there are a few people who are old friends who remind you of stuff you did, good and bad, that you forgot or blocked out. And you know, it takes places in snapshots that we all share, but that's how cultural memory is constructed. So he quotes here William James, who says that the apparent contraction of the years as you get older. So, you know, when you're 10, 15, 20, 25, years seem long. And then get to 40, 50, 60, years go by faster. And it's because of the way memory is constructed. The apparent contraction of the years is due to, quote, the monotony of one's memory content and the consequent simplification of the backward glancing view. In youth, we may have an absolutely new experience, subjective or objective, every hour of the day. Apprehension is vivid, the retentiveness strong, and our recollection of that time, like those of a time spent in rapid and interesting travel, are something intricate, multitudinous, and long drawn out. But as each passing year converts some of this experience into automatic routine, which we hardly note at all, the days and weeks smooth themselves out into a recollection of countless units, and the years grow hollow and collapse. In other words, in order to really live and feel alive and feel as though something has happened, something new has to happen. Or you have to feel that something new has happened. It turns out, when you spend a lot of time around books and records, whoever you are, new things happen all the time because the stories you were told about what happened are so incredibly small. There's so many other stories. There's gazillions of them. So what I'm here to do is to share some stories, and it's fun for me. Like I really like it. And I hope it gives you a sense that there's more to life. That's the idea, that there's the thrills are there. Anyway, so what we're going to be talking about is immigrant musicians, right? It's from these old 78 RPM rhythms. Here's one. This is the first one we're going to be playing tonight. It's from 1915. Talk about it in a second. But they're old pieces of stone, 70% ground stone, about 25% shellac. They weigh about half a pound, and they contain about 6 minutes of music on them, basically. So the deal was, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the single largest wave of immigration in US history happened per capita. Between 1880 and 1930, the number of foreign-born people in the United States remained always between about 13 and 14%. The number of foreign-born people per capita in the United States is currently just below 14%. America has been multilingual and multicultural for a long time, off and on. So during that wave, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, about a third of the people that arrived in that wave were from Southern Italy. About a third of them were from Eastern Europe, mostly Slavs, Ashkenazi Jews. And about another third were from elsewhere. So we're just going to talk about one of the elsewheres. And we're going to talk about women from one of the elsewheres, who were a profound minority within a minority. So I'm going to be talking about the Eastern Mediterranean, what had been the Ottoman Empire, speakers of Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Arabic. In 1920 in New York City, there were 9 Greek men for every 1 Greek woman. So let's talk about records a little bit. The first recordings made in the United States of people performing music in Turkish and Arabic were made by a guy named Benjamin Ives Gilman, who was born in 1852, who made a group of wax cylinders as an ethnographic document at the World Columbia Exposition, September 25th, 1893 at 8:45 in the morning at the Turkish Theater. The Columbia World Exposition in Chicago included a bunch of places from the world. You could visit the world inside the exhibition. And there was an Egyptian hall and an Algerian hall. He recorded tons of stuff of Fijian performers and Javanese performers, folks, American Indians from the American Northwest. He made just 7 recordings by 4 uncredited Turks, 2 men, one playing oud, another playing violin, and a woman playing, quote, tambourine, one of whom was a dancer well known at the fair as a star of Constantinople or some other locality. So that person may have been the breakout star of the Columbia World Exposition, who went by the name Little Egypt, which is complicated because there are like 4 or 5 different people who went by the name Little Egypt. Show you a book. It's a good one. Donna Carlton wrote this amazing thing called Searching for Little Egypt, where she was trying to find out who was actually the dancer. It may have been somebody named Mademoiselle Rosa. It might have been somebody named Farida Mazar Saropoulos, who was born in 1871, died April 1937, who was the Syrian wife of a Greek Chicagoan merchant. It might have been somebody else who performed for Edison several times, actually a couple of different people, made films for Edison very early on, 1896 to 1904. Anyway, Little Egypt was apparently very good and a big star of the exhibition. The story goes she gave Mark Twain a heart attack when he saw her dance. Now, the song she danced to was also a big breakout hit from the exposition. It's a song called The Streets of Cairo. And everybody knows it, all of us, because it goes, na, 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 na. There's a place in France where the naked ladies dance. There's a hole in the wall where the boys can see it all. That song that become in the culture shorthand for the Middle East. You know, a cartoon, when that song plays, you know somebody's supposed to be from the Middle East, right? Now that song was written by, let's say, a guy named Saul Bloom. And we know about Saul Bloom through Donna Carlton's research, which I'll just tell you very briefly because it's fun. So Saul Bloom was born in 1870 in Pekin, Illinois, Orthodox Jewish Polish immigrant parents, was raised so dirt poor that he went to school one day of his life. He worked at a brush factory and then went into business for himself at the age of 13 years old, buying and selling stuff as a merchant. He sold medicated window screens, which were supposed to, you know, the breeze would blow in, it would cure you of whatever. Total scam, didn't work. It was a Popeil pocket fisherman late night infomercial scam. Anyway, by 19, he was super rich, so rich that he was able to go by himself to the Paris Universal Exposition in 1889, which is the same place where Debussy first saw Gamelon, Gauguin first saw Tahitian painting, give you an idea. And he saw a troupe of Algerian dancers, female dancers. And he thought to himself, I'm gonna make $1 million. And he goes up and he signs them for a tour deal, comes back to the US by himself and starts looking for ways to book them around the country because he knows it's going to blow people's minds when they see this. There's nothing like it in the US, right? What he winds up getting is a job as the entertainment director for the Columbia World Exposition at a salary in 1894 of $1,000 a week. Way more than the President of the United States. And so he brings the dancers over, has them performing, and he gives them a song to dance to. And so that becomes this, you know, cultural hallmark and a big hit. Lots of recordings, tons of sheet music published. It was a big deal. Here, let me show you something. This is a photo album of pictures from the Columbia World Exposition. It's like a bootleg pirated thing that doesn't name the exposition. And this is a group of the dancers who performed there. One of them might be on these wax cylinders that Benjamin Ives Gilman made when he recorded 11 minutes of music, grand total, in Turkish and Arabic, which are housed at the the Library of Congress, and which you can only hear by going to the Folklife Center and sitting at a computer with a pair of headphones where it's streamed from off-site. Yes, I have. And they're kind of interesting, sort of. Anyway, let me read to you the caption for these dancers, because women from the Near East and dance and music, they're related. So we need to kind of deal with this first. Here's the caption somebody wrote for this photo. 3 dancing girls from Egypt. Well, maybe. Visitors to the Midway Plaisance theaters will recognize at once in these photos herewith 3 girls who delighted spectators by their contortion dances in the Egyptian theater. While their exhibitions were sensationally, if not sensually amusing, the girls were not otherwise calculated to attract attention, save it by being their immodest costumes. Writers of Oriental stories have created the impression among the uninformed that houris of the East are sylph-like and beautiful, but close contact reveals them as we behold them here, destitute of animation, formless as badly stuffed animals, as homely as owls, as graceless as stall-fed bovines. But truth compels us to add that the dancing girls in the Midway were not the best types of their race, either in form or character, and their abdominal muscles were the only portions of their anatomy or mind which showed any cultivation, while these, to their shame, were displayed to serve the basest uses. How you like that? What a jerk. Yeah, so Orientalism is a double-edged sword, right? It's yeah, it's a pain. So we have immigrants coming from the collapsing Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, among them a few women. So let's talk a little bit about how they wound up ever making records. We can say that the first recordings in Turkish the first recordings made commercially in the Turkish language in the United States were made 1912 under the auspices of a guy named Mugardish George Parzekian, who was an Armenian entrepreneur who was already working, importing recordings to sell to the immigrant community from the Near East. He was an Armenian guy, a speaker of Turkish. And he brought in a band to Columbia Records that was 3 Armenian guys and an Assyrian guy. And they made a bunch of records and they sold, and that kind of starts the Near Eastern record business. Now, Columbia Records and Victor Records were the 2 major record companies in the United States before the second half of the World War II. And Columbia started their E-series, Ethnic, in 1908 and started marketing music to immigrants who were arriving at a rate of 1,000 people a day, every day, just to New York City, not to mention Baltimore, Boston, San Francisco, all these other ports of entry, right? So they're trying to make some money. Money, that's what drives everything in America, right? And so they look at the largest immigrant groups, which are Germans and Irish, and they start marketing records to them. And then as time goes on over the next decade, they start marketing records to other immigrant groups. 1912, they start marketing stuff to Turkish speakers. Shortly thereafter, 1914-15, they start marketing material to Arabic speakers. The first recordings in the Armenian language are in 1910 by the Tajian brothers. The first recording in the Turkish language made by a woman is what I'm going to play you first. And I'm going to play it to you first because it has to do with this problem of memory. The name that they had for her on some discs is Lidet Hanim. Hanim's just lady. It was made September 7th, 1915. I just showed you this record. This was part of a group of recordings given to me by Christine Galabi, who is here in attendance, actually, blessing on her head. This copy contains no credits of anyone whatsoever. It just says soprano solo violin accompaniment, and that it's in Turkish. It's a song called Ben Bir Fendek Yayım, which it's an old folk song in Turkish from, I think, Rumelia, which is like Eastern Thrace, now in Greece. So just sort of north and west of present-day Istanbul. 19th century folk song. I believe the title translates as If I Were a Hazelnut. Fendek is hazelnut. Yeah, this is her. This is somebody, Lidet, we don't know who that is. And I think we maybe never will, but I shouldn't speak too soon, and I'll tell you why in a second. Now, the violin player, I do know, was a guy named Hüseyin Avni, who was born August 24th, 1896 in Smyrna, present-day Izmir, Turkey, arrived at Ellis Island August 11th, 1914, trained as an electrician and lived at 52 Rivington Street in the Jewish Lower East Side, was naturalized November 20th after having lived briefly in Pittsburgh in 1918, working as a porter. His brother Ahmed, who also went by Harry, was born 1887, worked in Pontiac, Michigan as an interpreter during the 1940s. Avni Bey, Hüseyin Avni, married a woman named Marion Meehan in June of 1930 in New York City. Irish girl, right? And because he lived on the Lower East Side, I thought maybe Sephardic Jewish who married a Catholic? That would be very odd. But it would be even odder if he was Turkish. Turkish people, 100,000 Turks arrived between 1820 and 1920. It's not a lot compared to the number of Armenians and Greeks and Syrians. And one of the big reasons was the Turks are Muslims. And America was profoundly, discriminatory toward Muslims. There was on immigration documentation when you arrived, only a few questions that you had to answer. One of them was, are you an anarchist? You had to say no to that. And another was, are you a polygamist? You had to say no to that. But if you were Muslim, the person at the immigration counter could simply check the "Are you a polygamist?" box yes for you. So a lot of Turks lied and said they were Armenian or Greek or Syrian, which was assumed to be Christian. And it was well known among Turks who did arrive that one should not come through Ellis Island, one should come through Boston, where you had a better chance. So the Turkish community was mostly in Massachusetts. And basically everyone in that community left and went home back to Turkey by 1930, right? There was just no reason to be here. So not many Turks came and very few stayed during that period. So, is he Jewish? Is he Muslim? What's the deal with Avni Bey? We don't know. And what does that mean for the other performers on this? Ledet Hanim and Selim Bey. We don't know. We don't have any information about them, and I've looked. So we'll just listen to a little bit of If I Were a Hazelnut. September 7th, 1915. She's an amateur. She's a squawky little singer. She's somebody that somebody knew. Now, Turkish women didn't appear on records until after the foundation of the Republic in the 1920s. As far as I know, no Turkish Muslim woman appeared on a sound recording before 1927 or something. So if she's Turkish, that's very unusual. Was she a professional of some kind? Was she a dancer? Again, don't know. I can say that Anna Athena Arkus was a woman who married an important violinist named Naim Karakan. Karakan performed on hundreds of records in the United States from the 19-teens, about 1915 as a matter of fact, up through the early 1960s. And he was from Aleppo, Syria. Very, very good violinist. So Anathena Archis was a Greek woman who was born in 1885 in Mersin, Turkey, in the far south, about 200 miles away from Aleppo. She arrived in the US June 15th, 1900 from Liverpool, England, with her first husband, with whom she'd already lived in the Hebrides of Scotland, and their son, who was born 1906, just a few months before her 16th birthday. She divorced her first husband, remarried an American citizen who was another sailor, chief steward on a boat, 5 years her senior. In 1913, she was performing as a dancer in West Hartford, Connecticut. We know this from a newspaper account that she was performing at the midway of the Connecticut Fair in 1913, which, quote, attracted the attention of the West Hartford authorities. What was this strange music issuing from the canvas walls? Surely such suggestive chords ought not be allowed on the grounds. And then the officials, one and all, piled into the tent, and the sight that met their eyes, they afterwards said, beggared description. A slow-eyed, no, we cannot call her a beauty, damsel was posturing in filmy draperies on a platform, making love, so 'tis said, to a snake, while another brunette with a waist cut lower than even Newport allows, and well, practically a slit skirt, sang an air to a tune furnished by tom-toms. It was too much for West Hartford, though some of the officials admitted they'd seen worse elsewhere, and they left the tent declaring it had to stop. Anyway, she was making a living getting up and dancing. And this is part of the deal with female performers, is that you're on stage and on display in a way that is very unusual. So singers in the Turkish and Arabic languages were almost always Christians or Jews. Jewish cabaret singers, and then a lot of Greeks and Armenians singing in Turkish. So I said that we would never know who Ladet Hanim was. Oh, wait, before that, a couple of quick points. First woman to ever sing in the Arabic language in the United States was Zakaya Agob Sheba, born 1886 in Damas, Syria, immigrated 1906, made 6 records around 1917, and worked mostly in the silk mills of New Jersey, big silk manufacturing place. I'm going to post an article to the chat about her by a professor at the University of Wisconsin named Richard Bro, who's done amazing research on her. Let's see here. All right. And then I'm also going to post another piece that he published about a woman named Ms. Marie, who performed in the Arabic language in the early 1920s on a little independent label called Malouf Records, run by a guy who was a pianist and composer named Alexander Malouf, who had a label that operated out of what was then Little Syria in Lower Manhattan. She turned out, one runs into women using pseudonyms on records all the time. And she turned out, in fact, not to be an Arab, but to be Armenian. Marie Bashian is her name, married a guy named Vendekian. She was born 1894 in Constantinople, and Dr. Bro's work on her or Professor Bro's work on her is just great. Okay, so he's finding out some stuff about some people. I said for years I would never know anything about a woman who recorded under the name Mary Steele, because her name is Mary Steele. And how do you begin to research somebody with that name? Now, Mary Steele had recorded in Turkish, Arabic, and Albanian between 1919 and 1921 for both Columbia and Victor. I said on a podcast, and we'll never know who she is. I played one of her records, which is the one I'm going to play for you, called Nare. And I just loved this record. I came across it at the Armenian Library and Museum of America up in Watertown, Massachusetts. And somebody heard this podcast I did, and he sent me a note by email which by the way is not hard to do because I am the only person on earth with my name. So if you Google Ian Nagoski, that's me. There's lots of ways to be in touch, please do. So he wrote to me and he goes like, oh, Mary Steele, that's my aunt. And by the way, I can tell you a lot about her if you want to know. And I said, yes, please. And he was this retired guy from around Northern Virginia, DC area. And he gave me all this information about his family. It was incredible. And from that, I was able to find out a bunch more. So I can tell you, Mary Steele was also from Mersin, Turkey. She was born February 21st, 1887, the sixth of 8 children. Her father was a guy named Hanaluk Bulad, who was born in 1856 in what was then Aintab, now Gaziantep in southern Turkey, and came from a Melkite Catholic family. He was an Arab. He studied at a Presbyterian missionary college in Mersin, where he met her mother, Frida, who was a fellow student and who was from Aleppo, Syria. They were married and had their first child. Frida may or may not have been Armenian. It's not clear. She may have been an Arab. I don't know. In the next 25 years, Hana took teaching jobs back and forth from one city to the next. Few years in Mersin, then Gaziantep, then Tarsus, then back to Gaziantep, then back to Mersin, then back to Gaziantep, then back to Mersin, and then finally by 1900 in Beirut, by which time there were the 8 children, all boys except for the oldest, Phoebe, and Mary, who was then 13. And they had a neighbor who was the American consul named Dr. Matheny, who was also a missionary. Dr. Matheny, noticing the massacres that were going on in the late Ottoman Empire of Armenians and Greeks, said to Hanaluk Bulad, you know, as a Christian, you should leave, or send the kids at least. So they sent the 2 oldest boys to the United States, 1901, and then 2 more sons. And then by 1902, Frida was totally disconsolate at the loss of the breakup of her family. So with sponsorship from a Presbyterian church, Hanaluk Bulad sold his possessions, packed up the family, including his wife, 2 small boys, 15-year-old Mary and her older sister Phoebe, Phoebe's husband and 2 children, and they all sailed together from Beirut to Philadelphia. And they arrived August 13th, 1902. The family settled in Philly. By 1910, 56-year-old Hana had left behind the life of a scholar and was working as an upholsterer, living on Glenmore Avenue with his wife and a bunch of the family. And that family basically stayed there in Glen Olden and Collingdale, which are these working class suburbs of Philly, except for Mary. Mary went on the road. Family documents say that she was married at 14 years old, but the first marriage that we're sure of was to one William Gladstone Richardson, January 1912, either in Iowa City or Chicago, depending on which document can be believed. They were both 25 years old at the time. He was a native of Farina, Illinois. They apparently had a child and were still married and living together in 1920 in St. Louis, Missouri. Richardson later died in 1958 and is now buried in Montana. Steele, meanwhile, continued to stay on the road for 30 years, living the life of a performer. She turns up in New York City, age 32, for 6 recording sessions for the Victor Company, October 2nd through December 24th, 1919, accompanied by a pair of portly guys from a Greek island called Samos. She initially recorded 4 songs in Arabic, and the first disc was given a blurb in Victor's Arabic catalog at the time. The song My Rose tells of a youth's ardent admiration for his sweetheart whose beauty he compares to a rose. They say she wrote this song. Anyway, March 1921, she records again, this time for Columbia at the Woolworth Building studio. 2 sessions, she knocked out 5 songs in combination of Turkish and Arabic after 1 or 2 takes. One of the songs was never issued. One of the songs was issued, never mind that. So by 1930, she's living with a Greek guy in the New Jackson Hotel in Chicago's Greektown. Occupation dancer. Her language spoken other than English, according to the census, was Armenian. May 1931, she marries another Greek guy named George Zamenos in New York City. That doesn't last. By 1935, age 48, she went down to Florida to take care of her widowed mother and took care of her for several years. Then she finally moves back to Philly to be close to the rest of the family, where she lives with an Armenian guy who is a rug cleaner for a living. Yeah, about 1948, she's about 60 years old and she dies in Philly, very close to where I grew up, and is buried there. So I'm gonna play you a little bit of Nare, one song that she made. As usual, I'm yammering on too long. I can already see that there's a record I wanted to play for you that I'm not playing for you. So I'm just going to move ahead a little bit if that's okay. And I'm going to retell a story that I kind of told last time I was at the Vanka place about a singer who I really love and who was the start of all this for me back in 2006, something like that. I was working I had a record store here in Baltimore. And, oh, sorry, wait, wanted to show you one thing about Mary Steele. So Mary Steele's youngest brother also went into showbiz. And the way he went into showbiz was not as a singer and dancer, but he was Ingrid Bergman's business manager and wrote a memoir of her. Yes, I bought a signed first edition. And it's dedicated to their father, Hannah Luke Boulad, who incidentally was a linguist and wound up working with the famous Egyptologist who discovered Tutankhamun's tomb very briefly. So thus maybe Mary's abilities linguistically, I don't know. Anyway, okay. So the person who got me started down this whole rabbit hole was somebody for whom there was basically no information available at the time. I encountered a record, I put the needle on it, it was good. I thought, how do you find out about who this could be? So I Googled her, which you do with everything, right? Now, 2006, you type into Google, Marika Papagika, and you get a 3-sentence biography on Wikipedia. And it says that she's from Kos, born in 1890. She made a lot of records in the United States, and she died of heartbreak in 1942 at the age of 53. That's it. So I went crazy and I went down this rabbit hole, and everything I've done for 15 years has been because I needed to understand Marika Papagika's life, because I really liked her. And there was no documentation and she had no descendants. She had no kids. So in order to understand her, I needed to understand everybody in her world. and all the other music that was made and all the history of where she came from and blah, 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 blah. And I wound up in 2011 publishing an LP that included a biographical study of her. And then since then, 10 years have gone by, I've learned a bunch more. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story of Marika Papagica, and then I'll play you a record of hers. So she was from this island, Kos. Sometime before she was 10 years old, her family emigrated to Alexandria, Egypt, where there was a huge population of Greeks, including the poet Constantine Cavafy, who, if you haven't read, by all means. And she works there as a nightclub singer for a decade. And she gets married, and she marries a musician. 1914, 1915, they record a few things for the company that was then called the Gramophone Company, the first record company there ever was, which are patriotic ditties about Greece. Her work was profoundly pan-Hellenistic. The Greek language itself bound together Greeks during a very difficult period when Greeks were scattered all over the world. Shortly after that first recording session in Alexandria, she and her husband, Konstantinos, Gus, as he was known in America, got on one of these steamships, came to New York City with $40 in their pocket. And then they vanish for about a year and a half, 2 years. Then they turn up. Where do they turn up? Pittsburgh. The first documentation we have of Marika Papagica is at a pan-Hellenistic conference shortly after the First World War, where Greek political leaders in the United States were campaigning to reclaim territory from Epirus and from Thrace and from the Dodecanese Islands from the other powers, from the Ottoman Empire in particular. And Marika Papagica got up on stage and sang a series of songs, including a Greek translation of Over There by Nora Bayes, Over There, which maybe you know. And then they're back in New York City by the end of 1918, and she begins recording for Victor Records. 7 months later, they record again for Columbia Records. And then they spend the next decade recording 250 songs. It's a lot of songs. It's a big repertoire. Now, what it includes is a bunch of different kinds of stuff. A lot of Greek folk music. It includes a bunch of modern kind of pop music. It includes some kind of Turkish folk music. It includes a wide range of stuff, but what it doesn't include are any of these dance pieces that Mary Steele or someone would have done. There's no Ceftacelli. There's no belly dance stuff. Before it was called belly dance, it was the hoochie coochie dance. That's what Little Egypt did. There's no hoochie coochie in it whatsoever. Marika was an artist. She stood on stage and declaimed love and other things, patriotism, first and foremost. She and Konstantinos open a little nightclub on 41st Street near the corner of 8th Avenue, which is on the second floor. It's a dingy, smoky, beat up old place, but it's the first nightclub that recreates the Eastern Mediterranean in New York City. It winds up decades later being imitated by a dozen different other places, which have a huge influence on the history of music in New York City. That's a whole other discussion. So they run this nightclub for a bunch of years until 1929. And then her career just ends in 29 on records. And they just stop making records. They move out to Staten Island. Now they move out to Staten Island a couple of doors down from their best friend, who's a record producer named Tetos Dimitriades. Dimitriades was the head of the foreign record division for Victor Records. He was a singer, good-looking guy, but he was a record producer, first and foremost. And he all kinds of stuff. He knew what a good musician was. He knew what a good performer was. and they love this guy. Now, his biggest claim to fame in retrospect is having published and pushed for decades a song called Miserlou. Da 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 da. Maybe you know it. It's been recorded hundreds of times. He turned it into a hit. It winds up being recorded by Dick Dale and the Deltones, which winds up being the theme song for the movie Pulp Fiction, right? Miserlou. That was Dimitriadis. He was a hybridizer of immigrant and American music and culture altogether. Best friends with Marika and Kostas. Anyway, they live a few doors down from each other there in Staten Island. He brings them back into the studio for a minute in 1937. Those records don't sell. I've never seen copies. They don't turn up. She was old hat by then. She was middle-aged. Remember what he said about when you're 40, the world doesn't make sense anymore. It's a thing about aging, that new styles come along and new ways of expressing yourself come along. And you can stay current for a minute, but then you basically have to stick with what you know. And that's a part of middle age for everybody. So they just retired. They bought a house for the equivalent of $117,000 there on Staten Island and lived quietly. She died of heartbreak. I just found out her actual death certificate. She died of a combination of heart disease and a cerebral hemorrhage. So she died of both heartbreak and brain break. Why did they retire? I said for decades, it was because of the Depression. When the stock market crash happened, the record companies massively restructured and got rid of tons of their ethnic performers who weren't selling enough material. And I thought that was the case with Marika, and now I've decided that it's not. What in fact happened is that their cellist died. A guy named Marcos Sifnios, who was from Thrace, left behind a wife and 2 kids, came first through Shanghai, then to San Francisco, then straight out in 1918 to Marika and Kostas's block where they lived on 41st Street. And he records on basically every single one of those 250 records they make. He's central to their life. And when he dies suddenly, that's when they stop recording. It's actually months before the stock market crash. They tried to make a few records after he died, and I think it just wasn't the same. I think they were family. And his death marked the end of her career, really. So anyway, I'm going to play you a Marika Papagica record. It's not the one I played last time. It's not the one I normally play. And I'm playing it because I just found it in the past few months. I got a call from a woman who sells junk on the same street where I had a record store in Hamden section of Baltimore. And these guys brought in crates of records, and I found a Marika Papagica record 15 years ago. Somebody gave her crates of Greek records, just like they did with me, and I bought them all. And in that crate, there was this record. Now, in the past 15 years, almost everything of Marika's has become available online. You can hear hours and hours and hours of her music. And this one from October 1920 has never been available before. This is the first time people are hearing it in 100 years. There are those records out there. The internet doesn't contain anything. There's nothing on the internet. I know it seems like everything's there. There's nothing on the internet. It doesn't remember. The mega mind doesn't work. What works are these physical objects, these stones. They remember, right? And you can find out stuff if you look. Anyway, this is a song of hers. It's called The Sunflower. And it's the trio. Marika, her husband, and Marco Sifnius playing cello. Okay, so I probably only have time to tell one more story here. Hang on just one second. Good Lord. Okay, so I said, you know, I would never know anything about Ledet Hanoum or anything about Mary Steele. Didn't know if I'd ever know anything about Marika Papagika. And I went around for years saying I would never know anything about Virginia Magidou. Name doesn't appear on any public records, and there's nothing written about her on the internet. She's not in any books. She doesn't exist. She's a cipher, right? And I used to go around, I used to play a record of hers called Mortisa Yanetka, which it's a cover version of a song by Rosa Ashkenazi, who was a wonderful singer, Jewish woman from Thessaloniki, who became a big star in the 1920s and recorded Mortisa Yanetka in 1937. Mortisa Yanetka translates as, I was born a badass chick. Mortisa is a complicated word. It means kind of like hipster, but it means somebody who, the original version of hipster, which means somebody who's been there and knows what's what, you know, somebody who's seen it all, that kind of thing. Anyway, Virginia Magidou in the 1940s recorded that song along with about 3 dozen other pieces, most of them in Greek, a couple in Turkish. She was a middle-aged woman by that point. It was clear she was roughly of Marika's generation, but we'd never know until I found a group of interviews with an accordion player named John Giannaros, made in 1986 by a guy named Steve Frangos in Tarpon Springs, Florida, that were put online at the floridamemory.com folklore website. And in that interview of the, whatever it is, 3.5 hours, 4 hours, there's like 7 minutes where they just talk about Virginia Magidou, and Giannaros, who was getting to be an old man at that point, remembers her. So that's all we know about Virginia now, is what he has to say. In that interview, he gives a couple of interesting memories about her. He says, she was the best singer in New York. She was the top singer in Turkish. She was a big club singer at the Port Said Club, very close to where she lived, around 8th Avenue, not far from where Marika's was. And he said, oh yeah, I haven't seen her in decades. She had been married to a Cypriot sailor and then to another guy. Her mother was Armenian, her father was Greek. And I'm just going to play you a little bit of this one record of hers that's just a rocker. It's just a beast. It's called I Suffer in Search of a Heart, accompanied by Marco Malcone and Nick Donath. Yeah, they barely hang on to it. It's the reason I like playing that record is because I think that's how it really was when they were playing live at these clubs around 8th Avenue in New York City. They're loaded. They're drunk. He is just blowing past bar lines and they get completely lost in it. The side of a record is 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes tops. They go on for almost 4.5 minutes, just blowing way past where you're supposed to end. They're lost in it. It's fantastic. Anyway, I'd love to have played you the whole thing, but you can listen to it online, canary-records.bandcamp.com. Now, so Giannaros, when he's talking about her, says that he hasn't seen her in a long time, but when he left, she was blind. And he says, do you want to know how she got blind? I'll tell you. Anytime it was to go into the studio for her to sing, the owner, who was an Austrian violinist, used to bring a gallon of booze. Now, the men who was there with the machine and his wife, they start laughing because Virginia, if she didn't drink half the gallon, she couldn't sing. She have to drink a half gallon and then to start singing. They say to her, Virginia, did you leave anything for us? She say, I left you half gallon. And then she would start singing. That's right, half gallon. And that thing was going on 6-7 times a year, the recording sessions. So Virginia is a very different kind of person than Marika. All right, I'll play you just one more very quick. When I started getting interested in Marika Papagika, I contacted another researcher named David Safa, who'd already done a little work on her. And I said, is there any way for me to find out more about Marika? And he said, oh yeah, you should talk to Diamantu Bacas. And Diamantu was the daughter of another singer named Amalia Bacas. Amalia was like Marika's best friend during the 1920s and 30s. One of her best friends, along with Dimitriadis. So Diamantu, Diamond, was babysat by Marika. All right, so this is 2006, 2007. Diamantu was 90-something years old. And I got her phone number. She was being taken care of by her son in Chicago. He said, oh, I don't know what's gonna happen here. He gave her the phone. I said, oh, explained to her what I was doing, trying to learn some stories. And, she said, okay. And I said, can I ask you, did you know of somebody named Marika Papagika? And Diamond had had a stroke and had fallen. And she said, yes, I remember him. You understand. And I said, yes, of course I do. Thank you so much. And that was it. That was the end. That was the last living person who knew Marika Papagika. Memory comes and goes. Is it all we are? Is it all we're made of? David Safa produced a really great reissue record of Amalia Bacas. And I just want to restate a little bit of his work so that some of it takes hold in your heart and you carry it forward. Maybe, maybe, maybe. So Amalia Bacas was born in Mazel Tov Matzah in 1897 in present-day Yanina, Greece. She was part of a 2,000-year-old community of Roman Yot Jews, Jews who were speakers of both Hebrew and Greek. 90% of the Greek Jewish population was killed during the Holocaust. So when she arrived in the United States, 15 years old in 1912, she was married to a guy named Jack Soretta. They had 2 daughters, Esther and Diamond. And they lived in the Jewish Lower East Side, and she went to work in the garment district. She went to work in a factory, just like Anzia Yazierska. But then she started singing in the clubs a little bit out of the house, and she starts performing on records, little independent record companies owned by Armenians, when Columbia and Victor stopped selling records in Turkish, Arabic, and Armenian on their own labels in 1920. So the early 20s, MG Parzekian starts his own label. Sohag is a new label, means nightingale in Armenian. And she starts recording for them. And then she starts touring. She tours widely for decades. Opens her own little coffee house nightclub for a minute around the corner from Marika's. Gets divorced. It's not going to work out if she's on stage. Her husband kidnaps one of her daughters, takes her back to Greece. Diamond stays, and the two of them have a nightclub act for decades. In fact, Amalia she was a getting up and shaking it for the boys kind of woman up her whole life. She had a withered arm, she had a deformed arm, but still they would do this act where it was like, oh, the boys all want the mom kind of thing. Anyway, she converts to Greek Orthodoxy to marry Gus Bacchus after having been Roman Yote. The only Roman Yote synagogue in North America is on Broome Street. She lived immediately across the street from there during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is a song that she recorded in the 1940s when she was rather my age, sort of late 40s, early 50s. It's a song about the governor, the Albanian Muslim governor of the town where she was from, Yanina, present day Greece, then Turkey, when she was a little, when her grandparents were children. So it's an old folk song that she remembered from where she was from. Just a minute of it. Ali Pasha, it's called. She's a lovely singer. Anyway, she lived the nightlife. She was a gambler and a drinker, toured all over the place, Philadelphia, Gary, Indiana, the Catskills, Detroit, Chicago, and lived hard. Had a temper, throw chairs if she was pissed at a club owner. Winds up going and living with Diamond in Tarpon Springs, which is where she died in 1974. Diamond died March 13th, 2013, 6 years after I spoke to her and she couldn't remember anymore. We are what we remember, and maybe that's all we are. I can't think of anything else to say right now. I guess we have to end. Thank you a million. Y'all are the best for putting up with all this and sticking around.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was wonderful. It's great to have you back with us. So, and Rich, I'll get you if you want to wrap up any messages.
I just thank you for hosting us. Thank you,
Yes.
Ian, for continuing to blow our minds and find this stuff and bring it back to life.
Okay. As I did put, and Ian put some information in the chat, and I did put some information in the chat about our next program, which is May 27th. We have another table talk. So I hope you'll tune in, and thank you all so much for hanging in and just listening to this really interesting program. Thanks again, Ian. We appreciate it.